everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about Harry Belafonte's memoir, My Song. In this case, I listened to the book on Audible. Now, before I get into the book itself, I'd like to talk about Harry Belafonte's story as it relates to my life. Harry Belafonte's story has always been one that's of interest to me. He was my grandfather's favorite musician, and I was familiar with his music from quite a young age. I've been familiar with the songs Day-O, Jamaica Farewell, and Island of the Sun for nearly as long as I can remember. And the older I grow and the more I learn about the world, the more I understand about the song. Now, I was mostly familiar with his music growing up, but the bulk of his activism happened well before my time. So a lot of the stuff that he was actually involved in, I honestly had no idea about. So for many reasons, I'm really grateful that I read this book, or listened to this book, however you want to call it. Harry Belafonte was a biracial musician and entertainer, most prominent throughout the mid-20th century. His album Calypso was a regular in my household. We have this album cover, but there are a few different ones. It was such a popular album. As well as being an internationally recognized musician, he was also well known for his activism. I think most remember him for his work in the civil rights movement, but he was also very active in other issues, including feminism and nuclear non-proliferation. While many other activists during the civil rights movement played an important role, such as Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, Harry Belafonte brought an unmistakable altruism to the table, and his calm, cordial nature influenced me from a very young age. While I learned a lot of important values from my grandfather and family, Harry Belafonte's example also laid out a code of conduct and set a precedent of respect by which we should operate and advocate for ourselves. While we didn't really talk about activism per se, I grew up understanding that activism is not performative. It's not loud or callous, it's not a competition, and it's not about how many marches or black friends you have. It's also not about vengeance, per se. It's important to understand that these emotions and frustrations are present, and you can't really do anything about that. But Harry Belafonte's example reminds us that we can choose how we act. We can't necessarily choose how we feel, but we can choose what we do with those feelings. His example showed me that activism is a set of values. It's establishing boundaries. It's educational. It's cool and collected. It's calm. It's unapologetic and it's assertive. It's standing up and saying, no, I won't take this anymore. Or, no, you don't tell me I'm this or this. It's standing up and claiming the freedoms that we're told that we possess, which on the other hand seem to be challenged because they either look different or follow different values from the American way. Listen, compared to the rest of the world, we're all here American as heck. That goes for hip-hop, that goes for Jamaica, that goes for this whole place. And I'd like to remind you that even though I'm referring to Harry Belafonte in the past tense, he's still alive and well at the time that I'm making this video. So go on over and check out what he's been doing. He recently made a cameo in the Black Klansman movie. But if you know the face, you know he's in there. So now that I've taken care of my personal affection to Harry Belafonte's story, I'll move on to the My Song memoir. My Song, a memoir, is essentially Harry's autobiography. It details his life from quite a young age. I'm not going to go too deep into his life because a lot of it is public information, and honestly, it's worth just getting the audiobook. What I will say is he goes into some pretty juicy details about a lot of public figures that he was involved with and worked with throughout the years. There's plenty of secret gossip and insider stories that you won't necessarily hear in public information. Harry Belafonte was born in New York, but spent a lot of his younger years growing up in Jamaica. He ended up dropping out of high school and enlisted in the Navy in 1944. While enlisted in the Navy, Harry was struck by the fact that the black service members were always sent to do the most dangerous jobs. They were sent to transport the most dangerous and faulty ammunition, while the white service members were given easier jobs or even leisure time. As I hope you can imagine, this kind of thing would stick with you. After his discharge from the Navy, he first saw a production at the American Negro Theater. He recalls being struck not only by the music and the power of the performance, but also by the representation. He was deeply affected by seeing this performance, and he volunteered to work as a stagehand for the A&T. He wanted to be an actor at first. Eventually, he would get into the New School in New York for acting. There, he studied with names such as Marlon Brando, Tom Curtis, Bea Arthur, and Sidney Poitier. As he began to get singing roles, he started to get noticed as the great singer that he was. Although he dazzled white and black crowds alike, as well as the agents that he worked for, he would eventually run into troubles when he was brought to white venues. His reputation and voice preceded him, but when he would show up and people realized that he was colored, he would be barred from entry at best and threatened and pursued at worst. In some cases with Klansmen threatening to burn down their whole white venue. One notable incident involved the public pool at the venue, which happened to be an inn. This struck me because honestly, in the last few years, there have been a few cases today where black families and individuals are being either accosted or sometimes driven out of public pools by either the white patrons or owners, almost 100 years later. There was some small satisfaction in the book when, after he achieved an international sensation status, he returned to the same pool and took a dip. But somehow today, in the 2020s, seems we've sort of regressed on that matter. I don't want to get into too many details, mostly because there's too much to break down here. But he covers a lot of behind-the-scenes info on the civil rights movement and his relationship with the Kennedys, including but not limited to apparently his own therapist leaking his private session details to the FBI. This therapist happens to be related to the Kennedys. He also breaks down the lead up to his being the first Black Tonight Show host, as well as his deep and close relationship with Miriam Makeba, who was already a star in South Africa, but became a sensation among the white progressive culture lovers in the West after Harry Belafonte brought her music to America. One thing that I really learned from Harry's memoir was that he was actually a lot more radical than his songs let on. Look, he was working with agents and he needed to sell records. He was trying to build an empire, an idea we're quite familiar with these days. But while many people point to Malcolm and Farrakhan as the radical, true activists, and often brush off Belafonte and MLK as integrationist half-steppers, Harry was often known to hold canceling his performances as leverage in the civil rights movement to achieve whatever end was necessary at the moment. Malcolm did great work, and his teaching, as well as Farrakhan's, has made a massive and profound impact on my life, to be honest, waking me up to the reality of history and what's happened. But we have to recognize that Malcolm and Farrakhan are working outside the white system, out in the open. Harry Belafonte had to play by some different rules. He was, in many ways, an inside job, slowly chipping away at systemic issues from the inside. One of the most satisfying moments from the book was about his movie Island in the Sun. I know the song Island in the Sun, but honestly, I haven't seen the movie. Harry Belafonte was one of the main characters in Island in the Sun, along with Joan Fontaine, one of the female leads in the movie. She was a white woman. Now, throughout the movie, there's a clear romantic draw between them, and Harry was insistent that there should be a kiss scene. But it being the time that it was, a black man could not kiss a white woman on television. It was prohibited by the directors. It would have been a marketing nightmare. But if you watch the movie, there is a scene where they're drinking from a coconut. Harry cracks open the coconut, opens up for the water inside. He hands it to her and she takes her sip. If you watch closely, when he takes it back, he turns it to where her mouth was, and he drinks from that spot. It's a very small thing, but it is kind of satisfying to think that one of these twisted bigots back in whatever year might have actually noticed that and just lost his marbles. That's one of my favorite parts of the book. He couldn't beat him then, but he settled for a slap in the face. And I relate to that. I didn't mention the pictures that I have shown up here. I already mentioned the album cover I have here. This one was regularly spinning on my grandfather's record player. We have here him and Miriam Makeba, and him and a very young Marlon Brando, and another of him just being a handsome devil. Another thing of note was his battle with tuberculosis. When he first started to experience his symptoms, medical treatment for it was not very advanced. There were some stimulant drugs that he would take or they would have injected, but while they helped for a time, it would always come back with a vengeance. He got through most of his career just re-upping on this treatment, but eventually it caught up with him. If you see his interviews now, his voice is really quite hoarse, and although I don't know the whole story, I'm quite confident it's related to that. Those were some of my highlights from his memoir, and it really ends around like the 90s or 2000s. In the years since, in his older age, he's continued to do some speaking events, but as his voice becomes more hoarse, it sounds like it's becoming more and more difficult. I think it's really important to note that Harry Belafonte is actually only 2 years younger than Malcolm X and 2 years older than MLK. We often think of these important activists as long gone, but Harry Belafonte is still quite alive, and despite his hoarse voice, he seems to be quite healthy. If these other two weren't shot, who knows if they would still be around today? It's very possible that they would be. So it's very common to think of this as long in the past, but it's really not. I know a lot of people mean good fun by the Deo at the sports games and like in that Beetlejuice movie, but it is kind of a shame that it seems like that's what his influence is relegated to these days. Ultimately, as unfair as it is, we ourselves have to be the ones to keep it alive and to let each other know that these people existed and they gave so much energy to build the world that we have now, as imperfect as it is. We live in the same world that these things happened in. It's easy to think of history as some story that happened long ago or in some book, but these things happen, and the consequences of these events and the ramifications of these conversations are still reverberating throughout our society today. Harry's true opponents have nothing to gain from making this information widely accessible. So let's take this opportunity to do better. What I'm saying is we have to be lacing each other up, because these guys aren't going to teach us this stuff, even though it's going to inevitably come up at some point in our lives. But it seems these days everybody's talking about this red pill, this blue pill, whichever, black pill, white pill. To me, it's one American material pill. Everybody wants the Louis bag, and that's great. Yeah, money's great, and for sure, financial education is or the lack thereof is a big problem. And you know, my grandfather is Chinese-Jamaican. He was born in St. Andrew's Parish. He grew up there. He was a mechanic. He's a mechanic there. He left around 20 years old. Mechanic and messenger in the war, and ends up in England. Met my grandmother, white Irish lady. She was a nurse. After the war, my grandfather, he had a fish and chip shop in London, came to Canada, he's a mechanic here. Point is, they worked their whole lives, right? They weren't thinking about Louis bag. They're trying to build what generational wealth they can. They're both trying to come up. And yeah, okay, so he's Irish, from a resistance family, you know, it's not no colonizer thing. Maybe it's different with these other ones. They're not my people, I don't know. Maybe you know better than I do. But I do know they're together for 50 years. So I don't know, you tell me. And yeah, things were awful then. Things were awful back then. But you know what, we seem to have lost something along the way too. I think we've swallowed the same pill. We've become the same thing that we rose up against. That's all I'm trying to say here. And before I go off the deep end, I think I want to leave it at that. Obviously, I can't recommend Harry Belafonte Memoir enough. For me, it was a very personal and emotional read. It's really enlightening too. I learned a lot that I wasn't aware of about him, and I have a much deeper appreciation of all the music that I already love so much. So if you're still here, I'm going to say I really appreciate you watching this, having the patience and the mindset to take in something like this. You know, it's not light stuff, but they didn't have it light. You know, Pop Can said, real ones never forget where they come from, and that goes for nationality and like the geography. Sure, it also goes for history. Those who forget the history are doomed to repeat it, and we're not out of the woods. It seems to me Harry had the best of both worlds. You know, we love to talk about the money line today. Harry wanted to build an empire, but he also refused to let the evil take away the life from his heart. And you know, we think all sorts of things are corny now. But you know, then we turn around and wonder where love is, right? So we have to put two and two together. So that's the bulk of what I wanted to say about Harry Belafonte's My Song, a Memoir. If you learned something about Harry Belafonte from this, I really highly recommend looking him up on YouTube at the very least. Or if you have the money or a spare Audible credit, get the Memoir. If you're still here, gotta say, appreciate you sticking around. This is the first one. This is definitely one of the more serious ones. If you want to see more of it, hit the subscribe button. If you want to help grow the audience for the channel, hit the like button too. I'll see you in the next one.